Step out of the vehicle, ma'am, because around here, I'm the law. Officer Daniel Mercer's voice cut through the rain like a knife dragged across glass. The flashing red and blue lights behind his cruiser painted the empty highway in violent colors, reflecting off the soaked pavement in trembling streaks. Naomi Whitaker sat still behind the wheel of her dark gray Mercedes, one hand resting calmly on the steering wheel while rain tapped steadily against the windshield. The engine had died nearly 15 minutes ago just outside Greenville, South Carolina, leaving her stranded beside a gas station that looked half asleep under the midnight storm. The neon beer sign inside the station window flickered weakly, buzzing every few seconds like it was struggling to stay alive. Mercer adjusted the flashlight in his hand and leaned lower toward the cracked window. "You deaf or just ignoring me?" he asked. Naomi slowly rolled the window down another inch. Cool rain air slipped into the car, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and gasoline. "Officer," she said quietly, "my car broke down. I already called roadside assistance." Mercer's eyes moved across the interior of the vehicle. Expensive leather seats, a clean dashboard, a folded charcoal coat in the passenger seat. But his expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. License and registration. Naomi reached carefully into her purse without sudden movement. Her motions were precise, controlled, practiced. The kind of calm that came from years spent inside rooms where one sentence could destroy careers or save lives. Mercer noticed it immediately, and something about her composure irritated him. Most people became nervous under flashing lights. Most people apologized too much. This woman didn't. Naomi handed him the documents. Rainwater slid from Mercer's hat brim onto the papers as he looked them over. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "This your car?" Naomi looked at him evenly. "Yes." He let out a low chuckle. "That's funny." Behind him, a lifted pickup truck rolled slowly into the gas station parking lot. A young white couple stepped out carrying fountain drinks and instantly noticed the traffic stop. The man nudged his girlfriend and pointed subtly toward Naomi's Mercedes. Mercer looked back toward the car window again. "You know," he said, "stolen luxury vehicles move through this county all the time." Naomi's eyes never left his face. "Then I'm sure you know how to verify ownership properly." That answer landed badly. Mercer's shoulders stiffened beneath the rain-darkened uniform. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly with distant chatter from dispatch. Somewhere across the highway, thunder rolled low and heavy through the clouds. Mercer shined the flashlight directly toward her face now. "Step out of the vehicle." Naomi blinked once against the brightness. "Is there a reason?" "I said step out." The couple near the gas pumps had started watching openly now. The boyfriend lifted his phone slightly, pretending to text while the camera lens pointed toward the road. Mercer noticed and straightened his posture immediately, chest pushed forward, one hand resting near his utility belt. "Ma'am," he said louder, "I don't like repeating myself." Naomi slowly opened the car door. Her heels touched the wet pavement carefully as rain dampened the edges of her navy blouse almost instantly. She stood there beneath the flashing lights, calm and composed despite the storm, despite the attention, despite the officer staring at her like he'd already decided who she was. Mercer looked her up and down. No fear, no shaking hands, no frantic explanations. That bothered him more than anything else. "Place your hands where I can see them." Naomi obeyed silently. Mercer circled slightly around her vehicle, flashlight beam dragging across the license plate. "You from D.C.?" he asked. "Yes." "Long way from home." Naomi glanced briefly toward the dead gas station sign, buzzing overhead. "Home travels with you after a while." Mercer smirked at that. Cute answer. He walked back toward her slowly, boots splashing through shallow rainwater. "Here's the thing," he said, lowering his voice. "People come through this county thinking money makes them untouchable." Naomi studied his face carefully now. There was no rush in her eyes, only observation, like she was measuring him quietly from behind glass. Mercer stepped closer. "But around here?" He pointed toward his badge. "I'm the law." For the first time, Naomi's expression shifted slightly. Not fear, not anger, just the faintest trace of disappointment. Rain slid down the side of her face as she looked directly at his badge number, then at his nameplate. "Daniel Mercer." She spoke softly, almost gently. "Officer Mercer," she said, "you still have time to handle this differently." He stared at her for a second before laughing under his breath. The couple near the pumps exchanged glances. Thunder cracked again overhead, louder this time. Mercer folded the registration papers once in his hand. "Lady," he said coldly, "you have absolutely no idea who you're talking to." Naomi held his gaze without blinking. Then she answered in the same calm voice that somehow felt louder than the storm itself. "No," she said. "I think you don't." For a moment, neither of them moved. Rain hammered the hood of the Mercedes in thick silver sheets while the police lights continued spinning across the empty highway like restless ghosts. Officer Daniel Mercer stared at Naomi Whitaker with growing irritation, the kind that came when authority expected fear and received composure instead. The young couple near the gas pumps had stopped pretending not to watch. The boyfriend lowered his drink slowly while his phone camera stayed fixed on the traffic stop. Naomi noticed it without turning her head. She noticed everything. The cold wind pushing through the station canopy. The smell of burned coffee drifting from inside the convenience store. The way Mercer's jaw flexed every time, she answered calmly. "Keep your hands visible," Mercer ordered. Naomi raised them slightly away from her coat. Her fingers trembled faintly from the cold rain, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, my roadside assistance should be here within 20 minutes. Mercer ignored that completely. He walked back toward his cruiser, holding her license and registration in one hand while speaking into the shoulder radio clipped to his uniform. Naomi could not hear the full conversation over the storm, only fragments swallowed by static. Possible stolen. Vehicle, registration mismatch, requesting additional verification. The words drifted through the rain like poison. The gas station cashier, a teenage girl wearing a faded green hoodie, stepped near the window inside and looked out nervously. Naomi caught the girl's eyes for half a second before Mercer turned back around. His boots splashed through puddles as he approached again. "Here is the problem," he said sharply. "The system is not confirming ownership." Naomi frowned slightly. "That is impossible." "Funny," Mercer replied. "That is exactly what people say when something is wrong." Naomi inhaled slowly through her nose. Somewhere beyond the highway, a truck horn echoed through the darkness. "You are making assumptions," she said. Mercer's expression darkened immediately. "No, ma'am. I am conducting an investigation." He emphasized the last two words loudly enough for the people recording nearby to hear. Naomi could feel the atmosphere shifting now. This was no longer about a broken-down car. Mercer wanted an audience. He wanted control. The couple by the pumps exchanged whispers while the phone camera remained pointed toward Naomi's face. The flashing lights reflected against the wet pavement beneath her heels, turning the ground red, then blue, then red again. Mercer stepped closer until rain dripped from the edge of his hat onto his collar. "Turn around." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. "For what reason?" "Officer safety. I am standing still with empty hands." Mercer gave a humorless smile. "You know, people always become lawyers once the handcuffs come out." Naomi looked at him quietly for a long moment. The rain softened briefly, replaced by the distant hum of tires passing on the interstate. "You seem determined to escalate this," she said. Mercer leaned closer. "You seem determined not to cooperate." The cashier inside the station pushed open the front door slightly. "Officer," she called nervously. Mercer looked over sharply. "Stay inside, miss." The girl hesitated before slowly stepping back. Naomi watched the interaction carefully. Mercer noticed. "Do not worry about her," he said. "Worry about yourself." Then his flashlight beam slid down toward Naomi's wrist where a slim silver bracelet rested beneath her sleeve. "Expensive jewelry," he muttered. "Nice car. Washington plates. Strange how things do not add up." Naomi almost smiled at that, but there was sadness behind it instead of amusement. "You already decided who I was before you walked to my window," she said softly. Mercer's face hardened instantly. "Careful." Naomi looked directly at him now, rainwater trailing along her cheekbone beneath the flashing lights. "No," she replied quietly. "Careful is exactly what you should be." The words settled heavily between them. The young man recording lowered his phone for a second, sensing the tension shifting into something colder. Mercer folded his arms. "Let me guess," he said. "You think filing some complaint is going to scare me?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward the cruiser where her license still sat on the dashboard beneath the radio glow. Then back at Mercer. "I think," she said calmly, that tonight is going to change your life." Mercer laughed under his breath, but it sounded forced now. Somewhere deep inside, something uncertain had begun moving beneath his confidence. He could feel it, even if he refused to name it. The dispatcher's voice crackled faintly through his shoulder radio again, this time sharper, more urgent. Mercer grabbed the radio quickly before Naomi could hear the full message. But she caught enough. "Sir, credentials." His thumb pressed the mute button instantly. Silence returned except for the storm. Naomi watched him carefully. The first crack had finally appeared. Officer Daniel Mercer lowered his hand slowly from the radio clipped to his shoulder, but the confidence that had filled his posture minutes earlier no longer sat quite right on him. It was still there on the surface, still hanging in the way he squared his shoulders beneath the storm, but now there was something underneath it. Hesitation. Tiny. Almost invisible. Naomi Whitaker saw it immediately. The rain continued falling in steady sheets across the empty highway, while the cruiser lights painted shifting colors over the gas station windows. The teenage cashier stood frozen behind the counter inside, pretending to organize cigarette cartons while secretly watching every second. The couple near the gas pumps had completely stopped hiding the fact that they were filming now. Mercer glanced toward them, then back at Naomi. "You think you are smarter than everybody else, do you not?" he asked. Naomi's wet hair clung lightly against the side of her face as she answered calmly. "No, I think you are nervous because dispatch just told you something you did not want to hear." Mercer's eyes sharpened instantly. "You do not know what dispatch said." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you mute your radio?" For a second, the only sound between them was rainwater dripping from the edge of the gas station canopy. Mercer looked away first. He walked back toward the cruiser, opened the driver's side door, and stared down at the computer mounted beside the steering wheel. The pale blue screen reflected across his face while he typed quickly. Naomi remained standing beside her disabled car, without moving. Calm, patient. The same composure she carried through federal courtrooms in Washington now sat quietly beneath the storm in rural South Carolina. Mercer checked the screen again. Then again. The database connection symbol blinked yellow in the corner. Weak signal. Incomplete verification. He cursed softly under his breath. "Problem?" Naomi asked from several feet away. Mercer slammed the cruiser door harder than necessary. "Do not start." He approached her again with quicker steps this time, irritation bleeding back into his voice. "You know what your issue is?" he said. "People like you walk around acting untouchable because you think education and money put you above everybody else." Naomi's eyes narrowed faintly. "People like me?" Mercer realized the phrase too late, but his pride would not let him retreat now. "You heard what I said." The young man filming whispered something uncomfortable to his girlfriend. Even the cashier inside lowered her eyes for a second. Mercer noticed all of it, and embarrassment immediately twisted itself into aggression. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Naomi looked at him steadily. "On what?" "Charge. Obstruction. I have answered every question. You are refusing lawful commands." Naomi inhaled slowly as cold wind swept across the highway shoulder. "Officer Mercer," she said quietly, "this is the moment where you decide whether tonight ends with embarrassment or disaster." Mercer laughed once, but there was no humor in it now. "You threatening me?" "No," Naomi replied. "I am warning you." Another crackle burst through the radio on his shoulder. This time dispatch sounded more urgent, louder through the static. "Unit 7, confirm subject name Naomi Whitaker. Repeat, Naomi Whitaker." Mercer grabbed the radio immediately and turned away from her. "Stand by," he snapped back. Naomi watched him silently while rainwater slid from the sleeve of her coat onto the pavement below. Mercer paced several feet toward the cruiser, lowering his voice. What exactly came back on her credentials? The dispatcher hesitated. "Sir, federal records indicate high-level judicial clearance." Mercer's jaw tightened. "That does not prove anything." "Sir, there is more." "What?" Silence crackled briefly through the speaker. The system flagged her under federal protection protocols. Mercer stared out at the storm without responding. His grip tightened around the radio until his knuckles whitened beneath the rain. Behind him, Naomi stood perfectly still under the spinning lights. Not smug, not angry, just waiting. Mercer looked back at her again, and for the first time that night, uncertainty reached his eyes fully. Naomi noticed it immediately. You still have not asked the most important question, she said softly. Mercer frowned. Which is? Naomi held his gaze. Why somebody with federal protection credentials is standing alone on the side of a highway at midnight. The words landed heavily. The couple recording exchanged another nervous glance. Mercer suddenly became aware of everything around him at once. The livestream camera pointed toward his face. The dispatcher waiting on the line. The cruiser lights reflecting across Naomi's motionless expression. The possibility that this stop had become something much larger than he understood. Then another set of headlights appeared far down the highway, cutting through the rain toward the gas station with slow, deliberate speed. The headlights moved slowly through the rain like two pale eyes cutting across the darkness. Officer Daniel Mercer squinted toward the highway while water dripped steadily from the brim of his hat. The vehicle approaching was large, black, and impossible to identify through the storm at first. Naomi Whitaker watched silently beside her disabled Mercedes, her coat darkened by rain, her posture still calm despite the tension thickening around them. The dispatcher's last words continued echoing inside Mercer's head. Federal protection protocols. He tried convincing himself it did not mean anything serious. Judges existed everywhere. Lawyers exaggerated credentials constantly. Maybe she worked in some administrative office in Washington. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, instinct had already started whispering something else. The black SUV pulled into the gas station lot with deliberate slowness, tires hissing across wet pavement. The couple recording lowered their phones slightly, sensing the atmosphere changing again. Mercer immediately straightened his posture and rested one hand against his belt. The SUV stopped near the edge of the pumps, but the engine remained running. Dark, tinted windows reflected the spinning police lights back into the rain. Nobody stepped out. Naomi glanced briefly toward the vehicle, then back at Mercer. That tiny movement did not escape him. You know them? He asked sharply. Naomi answered without emotion. No, Mercer did not believe her. Funny timing. Naomi looked at the rain sliding down the side mirror of her car. Sometimes timing is the only honest thing left. Mercer frowned at the response. Every answer she gave seemed to unsettle him more. Not because she raised her voice. Not because she resisted. But because she never sounded afraid. The cashier inside the station stepped closer to the window again, her face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Even the buzzing neon sign outside seemed quieter now. Mercer reached toward his radio once more. Dispatch, identify additional vehicle on scene. Static. Crackled back immediately. Negative registration available at this time, Unit 7. Mercer muttered something under his breath. Then the SUV doors finally opened. Two men stepped out wearing dark overcoats despite the storm. Neither rushed. Neither looked uncertain. One carried an umbrella, but did not open it. The other scanned the area once before his eyes settled directly on Naomi. Mercer instantly felt his pulse tighten. These were not tourists. They moved with the calm precision of people used to entering dangerous situations without announcing themselves. The taller man approached first. Evening, officer, he said evenly. His voice carried the polished tone of federal authority. Mercer squared his shoulders. This is an active investigation. You need to stay back. The man nodded once. Understood. Then his eyes shifted toward Naomi again. Ma'am, are you all right? Mercer stepped between them immediately. I asked you a question. Who are you? The man reached calmly inside his coat and produced a leather credential wallet. Mercer took it reluctantly. Rainwater slid across the gold badge inside as cruiser lights flashed over the seal. United States Marshals Service. Mercer's stomach tightened almost instantly. Why are marshals here? He asked carefully. The second man finally spoke. We received an alert tied to a federal security flag. Mercer glanced back toward Naomi. She remained motionless beside the Mercedes, watching the exchange with the same unbearable calm. This woman has not identified herself properly, Mercer said quickly. The registration system failed verification. The taller marshal looked toward Naomi. Ma'am. Naomi reached slowly into her coat pocket and removed a slim black credential case. She handed it over without a word. The marshal opened it beneath the gas station lights. His entire expression changed immediately. Not dramatic. Not shocked. Just instant recognition. Respect. He closed the credential carefully and handed it back with both hands. Good evening, Your Honor. The words landed across the parking lot like thunder. The cashier inside the station covered her mouth. The young man, filming, lowered his phone. Completely. Mercer stared at the marshal as if he had misheard him. Your Honor. The marshal looked directly at him now. This is Federal Judge Naomi Whitaker of the United States District Court. Rain continued falling steadily around them, but suddenly Mercer could hear every drop individually. Naomi met his eyes quietly. There was no triumph in her face. No smug satisfaction. Only disappointment. Mercer's mouth opened slightly before closing again. His hand slipped away from his belt unconsciously. The second marshal glanced toward the cruiser lights, the recording phones, the soaked highway shoulder, then back at Mercer. Officer, he said carefully, would you like to explain why a sitting federal judge has been standing in the rain beside the road for the last 40 minutes? The rain seemed quieter after the words left the marshal's mouth. Federal Judge Naomi Whitaker. Officer Daniel Mercer stood completely still beside his cruiser, water dripping from his uniform collar while the flashing lights reflected across his pale face. The confidence that had carried him through the last 40 minutes had vanished so fast, it almost looked painful. The young couple near the pumps stared openly now, their phones lowered at their sides. Inside the gas station, the cashier slowly stepped away from the window like she had just realized she was witnessing something much larger than a roadside stop. Naomi accepted her credentials back from the marshal with a small nod. Thank you, Deputy Marshal Grant. Of course, Your Honor, the man replied immediately. Mercer swallowed hard. Even hearing someone address her that way changed the air around him. It reframed everything. Her calm voice. Her patience. The warning she had given him earlier beside the cruiser lights. You still have time to handle this differently. Mercer suddenly understood she had not been bluffing. The second marshal looked toward the disabled Mercedes. Roadside assistance still not here? Naomi glanced briefly toward her car. No. The engine failed about 12 miles back. Her voice remained steady, almost gentle despite the humiliation she had just endured. That calmness unsettled Mercer more now than it had before. Most people would have exploded at this point. Most people would have demanded apologies, threatened lawsuits, shouted for cameras to keep recording. Naomi Whitaker did none of those things. She simply stood there in the rain, dignified and exhausted, while the truth collapsed around him. Mercer cleared his throat. Your Honor, I was only attempting to follow procedure. Deputy Marshal Grant looked at him carefully. Procedure does not usually involve leaving a federal judge standing in a thunderstorm while suggesting her car was stolen. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. The registration system failed. For 6 minutes, the marshal replied. Dispatch corrected the verification almost immediately. Mercer's eyes flicked toward his radio instinctively. Naomi watched him without speaking. That silence hurt more than accusation could have. Grant stepped slightly closer to Mercer, lowering his voice enough that only those nearby could hear. You also muted dispatch twice after confirmation came through. Mercer's face drained of what little color remained. The cashier inside the gas station slowly lifted her phone now, not recording, just staring at the local police cruiser through the glass with disbelief. Mercer rubbed rainwater from his forehead with one hand. Look, he said quietly. I did not know who she was. Naomi finally spoke again. That is exactly the problem. Mercer looked at her. She did not sound angry. She sounded tired. You treated me like I was guilty before you knew anything about me, she continued softly. And the only thing that changed your behavior was my title. Nobody answered. Rain tapped steadily against the cruiser roof while traffic hissed faintly along the distant interstate. The young man near the pumps looked down awkwardly at his phone screen where the live stream comments continued pouring in faster than he could read them. Deputy Marshal Grant studied Mercer for a long moment. Do you understand who Judge Whitaker is overseeing right now? Mercer shook his head slowly. Grant exchanged a glance with the second marshal before speaking carefully. Federal corruption hearings involving 3 state officials, 2 law enforcement contractors, and over $70 million in missing infrastructure funds. Mercer blinked once. I saw the case on the news, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked away toward the dark highway stretching beyond the gas station lights. Most people did. Mercer suddenly remembered something from weeks earlier. A courtroom sketch on television. A black federal judge seated behind the bench while reporters crowded courthouse steps outside Washington. He had not recognized her tonight without the robe, without the courtroom, without power visibly wrapped around her shoulders. That realization hit him harder than anything else had. Naomi noticed the recognition in his eyes immediately. "Now you see me," she said softly. The words landed with devastating weight. Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Deputy Marshal Grant stepped toward Naomi respectfully. "Your Honor, we can arrange transportation immediately." Naomi nodded once. "Thank you." One of the marshals moved toward the SUV to retrieve an umbrella. Mercer stood frozen beside the cruiser while rainwater collected near his boots in shallow, rippling puddles. Then Naomi turned toward him one final time before walking away. Her voice stayed calm, but every word cut clean through the storm. "Officer Mercer," she said, "authority is not the same thing as character." He lowered his eyes for the first time that night. The drive away from the gas station was silent except for the steady rhythm of rain against the SUV windows. Naomi Whitaker sat in the back seat beside a folded umbrella, her damp coat resting neatly across her lap, while highway lights slid across the glass in long streaks of gold and white. Deputy Marshal Grant sat in the front passenger seat, speaking quietly into his phone about rerouting security for the rest of the night. Naomi barely listened. Her attention remained fixed on the darkness outside. Behind them, somewhere beyond the storm and flashing cruiser lights, Officer Daniel Mercer was still standing beside the road, replaying every word she had said. Naomi knew that look well. She had seen it in courtrooms before. The exact moment pride cracked open and reality finally entered. Grant lowered his phone and turned slightly toward her. "You handled that better than most people would have." Naomi gave a faint, tired smile. "That usually means it happens too often." The marshal did not answer immediately. The windshield wipers swept back and forth across the glass with mechanical precision, while 18-wheelers thundered past in the opposite lane. "Dispatch already informed County Command," Grant said carefully. "There will probably be an internal review by morning." Naomi rested her head lightly against the seat. "That is their process. You are not going to file a complaint personally?" She looked down at her hands for a moment before answering. "I should not have to prove my humanity with credentials." Grant nodded slowly. The answer lingered heavily inside the vehicle. 20 miles away, Officer Mercer sat alone inside his parked cruiser beneath the gas station canopy, while rainwater crawled down the windshield in crooked lines. The livestream video had already spread far beyond Greenville County. His department phone had buzzed 6 times in the last 10 minutes alone. He ignored every call. The teenage cashier remained inside, pretending to mop the floor while stealing nervous glances toward him through the glass. Mercer stared at the glow of the dashboard computer without seeing it. Federal Judge Naomi Whitaker. The words would not stop replaying in his mind. But worse than the title was the memory of her face before he knew who she was. Calm, patient, human. He rubbed both hands over his face slowly. The radio crackled again. "Unit 7, report status." Mercer grabbed the microphone after a long pause. "Situation resolved. Supervisor requests immediate callback." Mercer closed his eyes briefly. "Copy." He set the microphone down carefully, then looked toward the highway where the black SUV had disappeared minutes earlier. He remembered her final words with painful clarity. "Authority is not the same thing as character." The sentence cut deeper now because he knew she was right. Inside the convenience store, the cashier finally gathered enough courage to step outside beneath the canopy. She could not have been older than 19. Her green hoodie hung loosely beneath the fluorescent lights while nervous fingers twisted around a paper coffee cup. "Officer." Mercer looked up slowly. "What?" Her voice stayed gentle. "I think maybe you should go home tonight." Mercer frowned faintly. "Why would you say that?" The girl hesitated. "Because you look like somebody who just realized something important." For a second, he almost snapped back defensively. The old instinct rose immediately. Pride. Ego. Authority. But exhaustion swallowed it before it reached his mouth. He looked away instead. "You recording too?" The girl shook her head. "No, sir." Then after a pause she added softly, "But my father got pulled over a lot when I was little." Mercer glanced back toward her. "Your father?" "He was Mexican," she said quietly. "People talked to him different before they knew he was a church pastor." The rain softened outside into a low, steady hiss against the pavement. Mercer stared at the steering wheel in silence. The cashier held out the coffee cup awkwardly. "You look cold." Mercer blinked at the gesture like he did not know what to do with kindness anymore. Finally, he accepted it carefully. The cup felt warm against his rain-stiff hands. "Thank you," he muttered. The girl nodded once and stepped back toward the store entrance. Before going inside, she stopped and looked at him again. "She never yelled at you," she said softly. Mercer swallowed hard. "No, that probably made it worse." Then she disappeared back into the fluorescent light of the gas station, leaving Mercer alone beneath the sound of rain and distant highway tires. He sat there for a long time after that, holding the untouched coffee while the flashing blue lights reflected endlessly across the wet glass in front of him. By sunrise, the video had spread across every major platform in the state. The clip lasted only 4 minutes and 12 seconds, but it was enough. Enough to show the flashing lights soaking the highway in red and blue. Enough to hear Officer Daniel Mercer asking if the Mercedes was stolen before verifying ownership. Enough to capture the exact moment Deputy Marshal Grant said the words. Federal Judge Naomi Whitaker. By 7:30 that morning, local news stations were replaying the footage beside headlines about misconduct, bias, and abuse of authority. Inside Greenville County Sheriff Department headquarters, the atmosphere felt colder than the rainstorm from the night before. Officers moved through the halls speaking in low voices while television screens mounted near the break room silently replayed the gas station footage again and again. Mercer sat alone in a small administrative office wearing yesterday's wrinkled uniform. His damp jacket hung across the back of a chair while untouched black coffee cooled beside a stack of paperwork. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, making the room feel even smaller. Every few minutes, another notification vibrated across his phone screen. Missed calls, internal affairs emails, messages from officers he had known for years, suddenly sounding formal and distant. Mercer stared at the reflection of the television screen in the office window. He barely recognized the man standing in the rain beside Naomi Whitaker. The arrogance in his posture, the sharpness in his voice, the certainty. He looked like somebody trying too hard to prove control. A knock came against the open door. Sergeant Helen Brooks stepped inside, holding a thin file folder beneath one arm. She was in her late 50s with silver streaks woven through tightly pinned hair and the kind of tired eyes that had seen too many officers destroy themselves with pride. "Morning," she said quietly. Mercer sat straighter automatically. "Ma'am." She closed the office door behind her and placed the folder on the desk without sitting down. "You know what is in there?" Mercer glanced toward it. "Complaint. Preliminary review." Her voice remained calm. "Bodycam footage. Dispatch logs. Witness statements." Mercer rubbed a hand across his jaw slowly. "I did not hurt anybody." Sergeant Brooks looked at him for a long moment. "That is the standard you are aiming for?" The question landed harder than she intended. Mercer looked away toward the television, replaying Naomi standing silently beneath the rain. Brooks folded her arms. "Do you know why? This exploded overnight." Mercer gave a bitter laugh. "Because she is a federal judge." "No," Brooks replied immediately. "Because people recognize the look on her face." Mercer frowned slightly. "What look?" "The look of somebody who has been treated that way before." Silence settled between them. The air conditioner hummed softly overhead, while voices echoed faintly from somewhere down the hallway. Brooks pulled out the chair across from him and sat carefully. "I watched the full body cam this morning," she said. 3 times. Mercer swallowed hard, but said nothing. "She gave you every chance to slow down." He stared at the floor. "I know." Brooks leaned back slightly. "Then why did you keep pushing?" Mercer opened his mouth once before closing it again. The truth sat ugly and heavy inside his chest, because for the first time in years he could not blame stress or procedure or confusion. Deep down, he knew exactly when things shifted. The moment he saw a black woman in an expensive car at midnight and decided suspicion came first. "I do not know," he muttered finally. Brooks watched him carefully. "That is not true." Mercer's eyes lifted slowly toward hers. She spoke gently now, not like a supervisor, but like somebody trying to stop a man from lying to himself. "You decided who she was before she ever stepped out of that vehicle." The words settled heavily into the room. Mercer looked toward the paused television image again. Naomi standing beneath the rain with flashing lights reflected across her face. Calm, controlled, dignified, even after everything. "She never once raised her voice," he said quietly. Brooks nodded. "That is usually what dignity sounds like." Another long silence passed. Then Mercer noticed something sitting near the edge of Brooks's folder. A printed photograph. Naomi Whitaker entering federal court in Washington wearing black robes, while reporters crowded behind barricades. Mercer stared at the image. Brooks followed his eyes. You know what she did after leaving that gas station? Mercer shook his head slowly. She attended a hearing at 6 this morning involving public corruption tied to law enforcement contracts. Mercer blinked. Once. Brooks leaned forward slightly. While you were sitting in your cruiser feeling embarrassed, she was still doing her job. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead, while Mercer lowered his eyes toward his untouched coffee again. For the first time in a very long time, shame no longer felt defensive. It felt honest. The federal courthouse in Columbia smelled faintly of polished wood, old paper, and fresh coffee when Naomi Whitaker stepped through security just after sunrise. Reporters clustered outside the marble entrance beneath umbrellas while camera flashes bounced against the wet courthouse steps. Inside, however, everything felt controlled. Quiet. Ordered. The sharp echo of dress shoes across granite floors replaced the chaos of the storm from the night before. Naomi moved calmly through the lobby carrying a slim leather folder against her side, while Deputy Marshal Grant followed several feet behind. Court clerks nodded respectfully as she passed. Attorneys straightened unconsciously when they saw her. The dignity of the black, judicial robe waiting upstairs seemed to already surround her even before she put it on. Yet beneath that calm exterior, exhaustion sat heavily behind her eyes. She had slept less than 2 hours. In her chambers, Naomi placed her folder carefully on the desk beside a framed photograph of her parents. Her father wore a postal uniform in the picture. Her mother stood beside him smiling softly in church clothes from another decade. Naomi looked at the photo for a long moment before loosening the damp scarf around her neck. There had been a time when traffic stops frightened her mother deeply. Naomi still remembered sitting in the back seat as a little girl, watching her father keep both hands tightly on the steering wheel whenever flashing lights appeared behind them. Yes, sir. No, sir. Slow movements. Calm voice. Survive the moment first. Feel angry later. A soft knock interrupted the memory. Her law clerk, Ethan Morales, stepped carefully into the chambers carrying a tablet and several files tucked beneath one arm. Morning, Judge. Naomi nodded faintly. Morning, Ethan. He hesitated before setting the files down. The hearing room is full already. Naomi removed her coat slowly. Press. A lot. Ethan shifted awkwardly. And people are talking about the video. Naomi looked toward the courthouse window where gray morning light filtered across the city skyline. Of course they are. Ethan lowered his voice. For what it is worth, ma'am, I thought you handled yourself with incredible grace. Naomi gave a tired smile that barely reached her eyes. Grace is expensive, Ethan. He frowned slightly, not understanding at first. Naomi rested both hands against the desk. People call it grace when someone absorbs humiliation quietly enough to make others comfortable. The room fell silent. Ethan glanced down at the files awkwardly. I did not mean, I know, Naomi interrupted gently. She softened her tone immediately afterward. You meant kindness. Ethan nodded once. Naomi looked toward the robe hanging neatly near the bookshelf. The truth is, she said quietly, if I had raised my voice last night, half the country would have called me dangerous instead of dignified. Ethan said nothing because deep down he knew she was right. Outside the chambers, footsteps echoed through the hallway as lawyers moved toward courtroom 3 for the corruption hearing. Naomi inhaled slowly and reached for her robe. The black fabric settled across her shoulders with familiar weight. Authority, responsibility, isolation, all stitched into the same garment. Downstairs in Greenville County, Officer Daniel Mercer sat inside internal affairs under pale fluorescent lights while an investigator reviewed body camera footage frame by frame on a monitor. Every pause looked worse than Mercer remembered. Every interruption sounded sharper. The investigator, Lieutenant Aaron Pike, leaned back in his chair slowly. You muted dispatch after they confirmed her credentials. Mercer rubbed tired eyes with one hand. I know. Pike stared at him carefully. Why? Mercer opened his mouth, but the answer caught somewhere between shame and pride. Finally he muttered, because by then I had already committed to the stop. Pike nodded once, almost sadly. That is the problem with ego, Daniel. It always doubles down after the mistake. Mercer looked toward the frozen image on the monitor. Naomi standing beneath flashing lights, while rainwater rolled down her face. Calm, patient, human. Pike folded his hands together. Do you know what everybody noticed about that video? Mercer stared ahead blankly. No, she treated you with more professionalism than you treated her. The words hit hard because they were impossible to deny. Back in Columbia, Naomi stepped toward the courtroom doors while reporters rose from benches the moment she appeared. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Questions flew toward her from every direction. Judge Whitaker, any comment on the viral traffic stop? Will you pursue legal action? Do you believe race played a factor? Naomi stopped briefly before entering the courtroom. The hallway felt almost completely silent around her. She looked toward the crowd of cameras calmly and answered in the same steady voice she had used beside the highway the night before. The law only means something, she said softly, when dignity applies to everyone before the title is revealed. Then she turned and walked into the courtroom while the sound of camera shutters echoed behind her like distant rain. The courtroom remained silent for nearly 3 full seconds after Naomi Whitaker entered. It was the kind of silence built from power, expectation, and fear all layered together beneath the polished wood and cold marble of federal court. Attorneys rose immediately from their tables while reporters behind the gallery rail leaned forward with sharpened attention. Naomi moved toward the bench with measured calm, the black robe flowing softly behind her as sunlight filtered through tall courthouse windows. Outside, rain still clung to the city streets, turning the morning gray and reflective. Inside, every eye followed her. Yet despite the cameras, despite the headlines already spreading across the country, Naomi's expression never changed. Controlled, focused, tired. She took her seat behind the bench and adjusted the microphone slightly. "Good morning," she said evenly. Her voice carried through the courtroom with quiet authority. The corruption hearing began immediately after that. Contractors, financial records, public infrastructure fraud, millions of taxpayer dollars hidden behind shell companies, and fake consulting agreements. Naomi listened carefully as attorneys argued over evidence tied to law enforcement procurement contracts across 3 southern states. Ironically, several of the same agencies now commenting publicly about professionalism and ethics had signed those contracts themselves. Naomi noticed the irony immediately, but never acknowledged it aloud. A judge's restraint was part of the job, even when the world outside the courtroom forgot restraint completely. During a short recess, Ethan Morales stepped carefully beside the bench holding a folded note. "Your Honor," he whispered, "there is a request from the Judicial Conduct Committee." Naomi accepted the note calmly. "Related to last night?" Ethan nodded. "They are offering additional security and temporary transportation reassignment." Naomi read the message silently before setting it aside. "Tell them thank you." Ethan hesitated. "That is all." Naomi looked toward the empty jury box thoughtfully. "Fear cannot become routine, Ethan." He frowned slightly. "You really are still going to drive yourself after this?" Naomi almost smiled. "Eventually." Ethan studied her quietly. Most people would not be this composed. Naomi looked toward the courtroom gallery where reporters shuffled papers beneath the soft hum of overhead lights. Most people are allowed to fall apart in public without becoming a symbol. Ethan lowered his eyes. Again, she had said something simple that carried far more weight than it first appeared. Hundreds of miles away, Officer Daniel Mercer walked slowly through the nearly empty hallway of Greenville County headquarters carrying a cardboard box filled with personal items from his desk. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly while deputies passed him without quite knowing where to look. Some offered uncomfortable nods. Others avoided eye contact completely. Temporary administrative suspension pending review. That was the official wording. But Mercer understood what it really meant. His badge now sat locked inside an evidence envelope. Upstairs, while lawyers and investigators reviewed every second of his conduct, the department television near the lobby replayed Naomi's courthouse statement again. The law only means something when dignity applies to everyone before the title is revealed. Mercer stopped walking when he heard it. The receptionist behind the desk glanced toward him nervously before looking away. Mercer stared at the screen quietly. Naomi stood there beneath courthouse lights with cameras flashing around her, yet somehow she still looked calmer than he felt alone in an empty hallway. He remembered the exact moment he first saw her beside the Mercedes. The assumptions, the suspicion, the confidence that he understood who belonged and who did not. Shame settled heavier into his chest now because he finally understood the truth Sergeant Brooks had tried to show him earlier. He had not respected Naomi because of her humanity. He respected her after discovering her status. And that realization hollowed something inside him. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. Another message from his younger sister, Claire. Call me when you are ready. Mercer stared at the screen before finally pressing the call button. Claire answered immediately. Daniel. Her voice carried warmth and concern at the same time. Mercer leaned against the hallway wall beside a vending machine, humming softly under fluorescent light. You saw the video? Everybody saw the video. He closed his eyes briefly. I messed up. Silence passed through the line before Claire spoke again. Do you remember when Dad used to get followed around stores? Mercer frowned slightly. What does that have to do with this? Because you hated it, she answered quietly. You used to get furious watching people treat him differently before they knew he was a veteran. Mercer gripped the phone tighter. Their father had spent 22 years in the Army. White hair, permanent limp, deep Southern accent. People respected him almost instantly. Yet Claire was right. Even then, Mercer remembered moments where cashiers watched him too closely because he looked rough or poor after retirement. Tiny humiliations. Assumptions. He swallowed hard. I became the thing I hated, he whispered. Claire's voice softened. Then maybe this is the first honest moment you have had in a long time. 3 days later, the rain had finally disappeared from Columbia, but the air still carried the damp heaviness left behind by the storm. Sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows in pale gold bands, warming the marble floors where attorneys hurried between hearings with coffee cups and stacks of files pressed against their chests. Naomi Whitaker stood alone near the window inside her chambers reviewing handwritten notes tied to the corruption trial. Outside, reporters still crowded the courthouse steps every morning hoping for another statement about the viral traffic stop. She had not given one. The silence itself had become part of the story now. Some called it restraint. Others called it dignity. Naomi simply called it survival. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Ethan Morales stepped carefully into the room, carrying a thin envelope. This was delivered personally, he said. Naomi accepted it with a small nod. There was no return address on the front, just her name written in neat block letters. Ethan lingered near the doorway awkwardly. Do you want me to screen it first? Naomi almost smiled. It is paper, Ethan, not a bomb. He gave a nervous laugh before leaving quietly. Naomi waited until the door closed before opening the envelope slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet of plain white paper. The handwriting matched the front. Careful, pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the page. Judge Whitaker, I owe you an apology that feels too small for what happened. I have replayed that night in my head more times than I can count. The worst part is not that I was wrong about who you were. The worst part is realizing I treated you differently before I knew who you were. You warned me more than once to stop. You stayed calm when I did not deserve calm from you. I thought authority meant control. Now I think maybe it should have meant responsibility. I do not expect forgiveness. I only wanted to say that you were right. Respect should not arrive after a title does. Officer Daniel Mercer. Naomi read the letter. Twice without moving. Outside the courthouse windows, sunlight glinted across parked cars and television vans lined along the curb. Somewhere below, reporters called questions toward another attorney emerging from the building. Naomi folded the letter carefully and rested it beside her legal notes. There was no satisfaction in her face, only thoughtfulness. Later that afternoon, Officer Mercer sat alone on the back porch of his small rental house outside Greenville. The suspension had emptied his days in ways he did not know how to handle. No radio chatter, no patrol routes, no uniform hanging near the front door waiting for another shift. Just silence. The wooden porch creaked softly beneath his boots, while late afternoon wind moved through the pine trees surrounding the property. His father's old army jacket rested folded beside him on the porch swing. Mercer had taken it from storage earlier that morning without really knowing why. Claire stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. Mom says you look terrible, she said gently as she handed him one. Mercer gave a tired laugh. That sounds like her. Claire sat beside him quietly. Crickets hummed somewhere beyond the tree line, while sunlight faded slowly across the yard. Did she answer? Claire asked after a moment. Mercer shook his head. I did not ask for one. He stared out toward the road. The apology was not supposed to make me feel better. Claire nodded once. Good. Another silence settled between them, softer this time. Mercer rubbed his thumb slowly against the cold glass in his hand. Do you think people can actually change? Claire looked toward him carefully. I think people can finally become honest. He frowned slightly. What is the difference? Claire leaned back against the porch railing. Change is easy to say after consequences happen. Honesty is harder because it means admitting the version of yourself you trusted was flawed long before anybody caught you. Mercer looked down at the porch boards beneath his feet. The words landed painfully because they felt true. Back in Columbia, Naomi prepared to leave chambers after another exhausting day of hearings when Ethan entered again, carrying a small stack of mail. One more thing, he said. Naomi glanced up. What now? Ethan hesitated. Internal Affairs released their preliminary findings this afternoon. Naomi waited silently. Ethan lowered his voice slightly. They suspended Mercer indefinitely pending full review. Naomi looked toward the courthouse window where evening sunlight now painted the skyline amber and gold. I see. Ethan studied her expression carefully. That is all you have to say? Naomi picked up Mercer's letter from the edge of her desk. Her fingers rested lightly against the folded paper for a moment before she answered softly. Punishment can expose behavior, she said. But only character decides whether somebody learns from it. Ethan looked at the letter in her hand, but asked no questions. Outside, the courthouse bells rang low across the city as the last light of day faded slowly into evening. The hearing room smelled faintly of old leather and rain-soaked coats the morning Officer Daniel Mercer walked into the Greenville County Administrative Building for his final review. Gray clouds pressed low across the city outside, muting the sunlight through narrow hallway windows. Deputies moved quietly past him carrying folders and coffee cups while avoiding prolonged eye contact. Nobody knew exactly what to say to a man whose mistake had become national news. Mercer wore a plain navy suit instead of a uniform. The absence of the badge on his chest felt heavier than he expected. He paused briefly outside Conference Room B where Internal Affairs had assembled a civilian oversight panel, department supervisors, and legal counsel. Through the frosted glass, he could already hear muffled voices preparing documents. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the glass door. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, a man who looked older than he had a week earlier. Sergeant Helen Brooks approached from down the hallway holding a legal pad against her side. You ready? She asked softly. Mercer exhaled slowly. No, Brooks nodded once. That probably means you finally understand the weight of this. He looked down briefly before opening the door. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly. Above a long conference table scattered with bodycam transcripts, dispatch logs, and printed screenshots from the viral video. The atmosphere felt less angry than Mercer expected. More disappointed. That somehow hurt worse. Lieutenant Aaron Pike sat near the center reviewing notes while two civilian oversight members whispered quietly near the far end of the table. Mercer took his seat without speaking. Pike adjusted his glasses and began calmly. Officer Mercer, this review is intended to determine whether your conduct violated departmental standards regarding bias, escalation, and misuse of authority. Mercer nodded once. Understood. Pike folded his hands together. Before we begin formal questioning, is there anything you wish to say? Silence stretched across the room. Mercer glanced toward the printed still image resting on top of the evidence file. Naomi Whitaker standing beneath police lights in the rain. Calm. Exhausted. Dignified. He swallowed hard. Yes, he said quietly. Every eye in the room lifted toward him. Mercer drew a slow breath. When I stopped Judge Whitaker, I told myself I was following instinct and procedure. But the truth is, I made assumptions before facts. Nobody interrupted him. I treated her suspicion as the starting point. Not because of evidence. Because of perception. His voice tightened slightly. And the worst part is, I did not fully recognize my behavior until I learned her title. Sergeant Brooks lowered her eyes briefly while Pike listened without expression. Mercer continued carefully. That means if she had been someone without power, without credentials, without cameras recording, I probably would have walked away believing I handled that stop correctly. The room remained silent except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. One of the civilian oversight members, an older black woman named Denise Carter, leaned forward slightly. Why does that realization matter now? Mercer looked directly at her. Because authority without self-awareness becomes dangerous faster than most people realize. Denise studied him carefully for several seconds before leaning back again. Pike opened the bodycam transcript. Folder slowly. Judge Whitaker declined to file a personal complaint against you. Mercer blinked once. She did. Yes. Pike adjusted the papers in front of him. In fact, she submitted a statement this morning recommending corrective review over punitive retaliation. Mercer stared at him in disbelief. Why? Pike glanced down at the statement briefly before answering. Her exact words were, "Justice should teach whenever possible before it destroys." Mercer lowered his eyes immediately. Something painful tightened inside his chest because mercy felt far heavier than anger would have. Across the state in Columbia, Naomi Whitaker stood alone inside her chambers after concluding another exhausting hearing day. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows while courthouse staff filtered quietly through distant hallways preparing to leave for the evening. Ethan Morales stepped inside, carrying the final draft of the Oversight Committee update. They finished the review, he said carefully. Naomi accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. And Ethan hesitated. Recommended suspension, mandatory retraining, and removal from field supervision pending reevaluation. Naomi nodded faintly. I see. Ethan studied her expression. Most people expected you to demand harsher consequences. Naomi walked slowly toward the courthouse window overlooking the wet city streets below. Headlights reflected across puddles like broken ribbons of gold. Punishment alone rarely changes people, she said softly. Ethan frowned slightly. Then what does? Naomi thought about the gas station. The rain. Mercer standing frozen beside his cruiser after finally understanding what he had done. She answered without turning around. Humility, she said quietly. But only if somebody is brave enough to face it honestly. 2 weeks later, autumn sunlight spilled softly across the federal courthouse plaza in Columbia while the city moved through another ordinary Thursday morning. Lawyers hurried up marble steps balancing coffee trays and legal briefs, while reporters waited lazily near the entrance hoping for a story important enough to interrupt routine. The frenzy surrounding the viral traffic stop had finally begun fading from headlines, replaced by elections, scandals, and whatever outrage arrived next. But for the people directly involved, nothing felt entirely ordinary anymore. Inside Courtroom 3, Naomi Whitaker finished reviewing final arguments in the corruption case that had consumed nearly 6 months of her life. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished oak and printer ink, while ceiling lights glowed warm against the dark wood walls. Attorneys gathered their papers quietly as Naomi adjusted her glasses and delivered the final procedural instructions with the same calm precision she carried into every hearing. No raised voice. No wasted movement. Just discipline shaped by decades of surviving rooms that underestimated her before she ever spoke. When court adjourned, the gallery slowly emptied beneath the low murmur of conversations and moving chairs. Ethan Morales remained near the bench, organizing legal files into neat stacks. You have one more appointment downstairs, he reminded gently. Naomi frowned slightly. I thought my schedule cleared afternoon. Ethan hesitated before answering. It was added this morning. Naomi noticed the unusual tone immediately. Who requested it? Ethan glanced toward the closed courtroom doors. Officer Mercer. Silence settled between them for a moment. Naomi looked down at the notes in front of her before removing her glasses slowly. And you approve this? Ethan shifted awkwardly. I thought you might want the choice. Naomi said nothing at first. Outside the tall courtroom windows, sunlight reflected off passing cars and drifting clouds. Finally, she nodded once. 5 minutes. 20 minutes later, Naomi stepped into a quiet conference room on the courthouse's lower floor. The room was simple and nearly empty except for a polished wooden table, 2 chairs, and a large window overlooking the parking garage below. Daniel Mercer stood near the far wall holding a folded sheet of paper in nervous hands. He wore no uniform, just a gray button-down shirt with sleeves rolled neatly at the wrists. The moment Naomi entered, he straightened instinctively. Your Honor. Naomi closed the door. Softly behind her. Officer Mercer. He lowered his eyes briefly. Former officer, probably. Naomi remained standing for a moment before taking the chair across from him. Mercer stayed standing another second too long, uncertain whether he deserved to sit. Naomi noticed immediately. Please, she said quietly. Sit down. He obeyed carefully. For several seconds, neither spoke. The air conditioner hummed softly overhead, while distant courthouse footsteps echoed faintly through the hallway outside. Mercer finally placed the folded paper on the table between them. I wrote another apology, he admitted. Naomi glanced at the paper but did not touch it. Why another one? Mercer swallowed hard. Because the first one was about guilt. He looked directly at her now. This one is about understanding. Naomi studied his face carefully. The arrogance from the highway was gone. What remained looked quieter, smaller somehow, but more honest. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. I spent my whole career thinking being fair meant treating everybody the same after I already decided who they were. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. And now, he gave a faint, humorless smile. Now I think fairness starts before suspicion does. The words settled heavily between them. Naomi looked toward the courthouse window for a moment. Sunlight reflected softly against the glass table surface between them. That realization cost you a great deal, she said quietly. Mercer nodded once. It should have. Another silence passed. Then Mercer looked down briefly before speaking again. What I did to you? His voice tightened slightly. I keep replaying it because I know if your title had been different, I probably never would have questioned myself. Naomi's expression softened just slightly, though sadness still lingered beneath it. That truth matters more than you realize, she said. Mercer looked at her carefully. Why did you not destroy me when you had every right? Naomi folded her hands calmly atop the table. Because humiliation rarely teaches people anything useful. Mercer stared at her in silence. Naomi continued softly. Pain can make people defensive. Reflection changes them only if they choose honesty first. He looked down at the folded apology letter again. I do not know what happens next for me. Naomi's voice remained calm. That depends on whether this experience becomes embarrassment or transformation. Mercer exhaled slowly. The weight in the room felt different now. Not hostile. Not comfortable either. Honest. Naomi finally stood from the table and gathered her folder beneath one arm. Mercer rose immediately as well. Before leaving, Naomi paused beside the door and looked back at him one final time. Officer Mercer, she said quietly, the badge did not make you cruel. He lowered his eyes slowly, already knowing the rest before she spoke it aloud. You chose that yourself. 6 months later, winter settled softly over Columbia with cold sunlight stretching across the federal courthouse in pale silver bands. The sharp winds of December carried the scent of rain and chimney smoke through downtown streets, while people hurried beneath scarves and heavy coats toward offices, coffee shops, and buses disappearing into the morning traffic. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors reflected the glow of holiday decorations placed carefully near the entrance. A small evergreen tree stood beside the security checkpoint covered in white lights that shimmered against polished stone. Naomi Whitaker walked through the lobby carrying a leather folder beneath one arm, while courthouse staff greeted her quietly in passing. Another hearing day. Another stack of decisions waiting upstairs. The world had moved on from the traffic stop months ago. News cycles always did. But some moments never fully left the people inside them. Naomi pressed the elevator button calmly, while reading through handwritten notes for an afternoon sentencing hearing. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. She stepped inside alone just as another voice called from down the hallway. Hold the elevator, please. Naomi looked up instinctively. Daniel Mercer crossed the lobby carrying 2 cardboard boxes filled with binders and folders pressed awkwardly against his chest. He wore a dark wool coat now instead of a police uniform. No badge. No radio. Just a tired man trying to balance paperwork while weaving through courthouse foot traffic. The moment he recognized Naomi inside the elevator, he stopped short. For half a second, the old embarrassment flashed across his face again. Naomi placed one hand against the elevator door sensor before it could close. Mercer hesitated. You do not have to. The elevator is not a courtroom, Officer Mercer, she said softly. You are allowed inside. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth despite himself. He stepped into the elevator carefully, setting the boxes down near his feet while the doors slid shut behind them. Warm yellow light filled the small space as the elevator began rising slowly through the building. For several seconds, neither spoke. The quiet felt different now than it had months earlier. Less tense. More reflective. Naomi glanced toward the binders stacked in his arms. New job. Mercer nodded once. Community Compliance Office. He almost laughed softly afterward. Mostly paperwork and outreach training. Naomi looked back toward the glowing floor numbers above the door. And how is it going? Mercer considered the question honestly before answering. Slower than patrol work. Then after a pause he added quietly, but probably more important than I realized before. Naomi nodded faintly. Outside the elevator, courthouse floors passed steadily one after another. Mercer glanced toward her carefully. I used to think respect came from authority, he admitted softly. Now I think real respect is how you treat people when nobody important is watching. Naomi's eyes lifted toward him briefly. That lesson cost you something. Mercer looked down at the boxes near his feet. Yes. Another pause settled between them, gentle this time. But maybe it needed to. The elevator hummed softly upward. Naomi studied him for a moment and noticed something she had not seen the night beside the highway. Humility had changed the shape of him. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but honestly. The bitterness she expected never appeared. Neither did resentment. Just accountability worn quietly over time. The elevator slowed near the 8th floor. Before the doors opened, Mercer spoke. Again, I never thanked you. Naomi frowned slightly. For what? He met her eyes carefully. For not turning my worst moment into the end of my life. Silence settled once more between them. Then the elevator doors opened with a soft metallic chime. Naomi stepped forward before stopping briefly near the threshold. Lawyers moved through the hallway outside, carrying files beneath warm courthouse lights, while distant footsteps echoed across marble floors. Naomi turned back toward Mercer one final time. Mr. Mercer, she said quietly, consequences are supposed to reveal character, not replace it. He lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Naomi gave a small nod before stepping into the hallway. Mercer remained inside the elevator, watching her walk away beneath the courthouse lights, black judicial robe moving softly behind her like calm water through stone. No anger, no revenge, no victory speech, just dignity. The doors slowly closed between them while winter sunlight spilled across the marble floor outside. And for the first time since that stormy night beside the highway, Daniel Mercer understood something clearly without needing a badge, a courtroom, or a camera to explain it to him. Power could force obedience. Fear could control silence. But dignity was the thing people carried long after authority disappeared.